Friends, we're going to settle on in and begin. And I want to welcome you. My name is Margaret Cooley. I'm the director of Woolman Hill Retreat Center located in Western Massachusetts on the land of the Pecumtuck. And we welcome you to settle into your space, get comfortable. I'd like to ask folks to just welcome each other from all of the various places you are arriving from. We have people in Portland, Maine, and Portland, Oregon, and all in between, and even across the ocean. So welcome wherever you're coming from. Welcome if this is your first session with us with the Walking with the Bible series, or if you're returning after being with us with Carl Magruder last month. And welcome however long you have been walking in Quaker circles, and however long you do or do not know Woolman Hill or Beacon Hill Friends House. We are really grateful to have you join us in this adventure. I'd like to welcome Peter Blood as our sort of collaborator and host of these series. And tonight we'll be hearing from Adria Gulizia, who is in the New York City area. And we'll have Peter Letzen eldering for us. And we'd like to thank Sarah Cushman, who will be reading the passage aloud when we get to that point. We're going to settle into some worship and then have Peter bring us out of that worship after we hear from Jen as the tech host, and we'll have a little time to hear from Adria as the guest presenter, her relationship to the Bible and the reasons she chose the particular passage for this evening. So again, invite you to settle in. Imagine yourself and the beauty of Woolman Hill, where the meadows and fields and lawn and woods are all turning from their golden and red and orange and yellows into a more muted brown and kind of russet colors, still full of variation, slightly more muted, slightly more deep. And as of a couple of nights ago, just a very gentle, soft covering of white snow. I'm going to turn it over to Jen as the tech host.
Thank you, Margaret. So as Margaret said, my name is Jen Higgins-Newman, and I'm the program manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House. So for those who are joining today for the first time in this series, Beacon Hill Friends House is a Quaker Center for Learning and Action and a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values based in downtown Boston, Massachusetts. That is all I have. Again, welcome friends. We're so glad to have you on this walk with us.
Living Spirit, living God, we know that many people are feeling filled with fear, anxiety about our country and our world. Help us to feel your presence among us today. To feel your care of us and all Welcome to this kind of experiment, this journey that we just began last month with Carl Magruder. So grateful to have Adria Gulizia, who've had the deep privilege to work with before. And so grateful for the passage she's been led to tonight, which she'll share with you soon if you haven't looked at it already. Our goal here is, above all, to not go to our heads in response to these words, but to allow God to speak to our hearts as we hear these words and hear each other's voices. So welcome, Adria, and why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about your own journey with this this book? That, briefly.
Right.
And I think also, if there's anything you want to share right now about, what you found particularly is helpful, that this is your opportunity to share that.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Peter and Jennifer and Margaret, for this program. And it is wonderful to be with you all this afternoon, evening. I feel like it's evening now, even though maybe last week it would have been just afternoon. I don't know. But my journey with the Bible started when I will say about 5. I was raised Baptist at there was no Black Baptist church in the town where I lived, which was Shrewsbury, New Jersey. We were one of 2 Black families. So we went to Asbury Park to a Second Baptist church. And the Bible was part of the order of worship. I did Sunday school almost every Sunday, and vacation Bible school for a week in the summer. So that was my introduction to the Bible, and read it in other contexts when I took a Jewish civilization class in college. But what's funny is, despite the fact that, of course, I'd been exposed to the Bible regularly, it didn't start to really land with me until I re-encountered it as a friend. I started attending Quaker meeting in St. Louis Friends meeting when I was 21, and read the Journal of George Fox. And, of course, he quotes the Bible extensively in the journal. And as I was reading his interpretation of these passages that I had read, his words struck me to my heart. And all of a sudden, instead of being somebody else's words that I had read and generally approved of, but didn't really feel connected to, those words of scripture started penetrating my heart in a way that was new, in a way that made it feel like this is mine also. This truth is mine also. These words are mine also. And then I read Michael Burkle's Engaging Scripture. And then the wonderful late Mia Kissel Hewitt, who was a friend in my meeting, Chatham Summit meeting and New York Yearly meeting, wanted to do a Read the Bible in a Year group. And we had like a Facebook group, and I loved it so much that we did it again the next year. And to be able to read it and to read these words and parts of the Bible. I mean, who sits around reading numbers? I mean, somebody does. Somebody wants to know how many cubits were in the curtains in the temple. But that person was never me. And yet reading it and reading the whole Bible in a new way, sitting with passages that I knew and passages that I'd never read before, it just hit me in a new way. because I was reading it not just with my head, but also with my heart. And so, you know, I'm not the most regular. I'm not one of those people who wakes up and spends like a half an hour reading their Bible every morning or anything like that. And yet, whenever I do, I have, the passages land with me in a different way. And so I can quote, I can quote the Bible extensively, though I never can remember where anything comes from. But it's because when I read it with the heart, and when I read it to listen to what God has to say to me now, the words stick with me in a way that they never did before. And so I guess that's what I would say for, what I found useful, is to read with the heart. And I think that there are two dangers that I've seen both of them to avoid. One is, to read the Bible like you read a cookbook, or, it's like, I just follow the steps. And, if you put in a pinch of chastity and, 3/4 of a cup of integrity and, 1.8 grams of worship, like at the end, you take it out of the oven and you have righteousness, and like, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, we're just done. And so to read it overly literally and overly prescriptively, I think, is an error. But then the other error that I've seen is to over spiritualize it. I remember reading in a friend's context about Jesus raising Lazarus, and said, the presenter said, well, if you want to read this as like, maybe Lazarus was sick, or maybe Lazarus was depressed. I know that, reading it as like Lazarus getting raised from the dead, might just be, a bit much. So feel free to dial it back. And to me, that does a disservice to the text. It's not as though people in the first century didn't know that you couldn't be raised from the dead. So to think that, oh, well, in our modern times, we know so much better than, those poor primitive people who wrote the Bible. So let's just make it super spiritual. I think takes away some of the challenge. You may need to hear that Jesus can lift you out of depression. You may need to hear that Christ can heal you from sickness. But what does it mean to confront Christ as Lord over life and death? What kind of courage can that give you to say, whoa, these earthly authorities, these earthly powers, these political authorities, these police officers and judges and, militiamen in the street, they can only take away my life, but Christ can give that back to me. And even if he doesn't in this life, in the day of judgment, he will. So what kind of courage does it give you to say, like, we're following a power that's greater than life and death, physical life and death? And so, maybe that's more than what you were asking for, but or maybe that's exactly what you were asking for, but that's what I found. Read with the heart, and read being open to challenge open to being challenged for how you think and how you live, and reflecting on, what if it were really true? What would it mean if what I'm reading were really true? And how do I deal with the discomfort of that? And how do I deal with the challenge of that?
Yeah, I can't resist not saying that it was not only modern friends that had trouble with the idea of raising from the dead, because George Fox, wrote a lot about some of those lifting from the dead stories, and it all got censored out of his writings because people thought that was too much to handle. So yeah, we could talk about that later. Anyway.
I hope we will. That sounds
tell us what brought you to this, Jeremiah, I would say challenging book. Speaking of challenging, lot of tough stuff in there, but what brought you to this chapter, these verses right now at this particular moment, Adria?
Well, it started with, a line that, I have plans for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And that was kind of bouncing around in my heart. So I went to Bible Gateway. I typed it into Google. I was like, I can't remember where this comes from. Somewhere in the prophets, but like which prophet? Who knows? And Google directed me to Jeremiah, and so I read the longer passage. And it just struck me. It struck me because, you know, I think a lot and have over the last few years about, and Jennifer's very helpfully put in the chat, like the verses that we're specifically talking about, Jeremiah 29, verses 4 to 14. I've been thinking an awful lot in the last few years about Babylon. And even though I'm scandalously delinquent in updating my blog, it came to me walking with Jesus in the shadow of Babylon. What does it mean to follow Christ in hostile territory, in a world that does not encourage us to simplicity, that encourages us to excess, in a world that does not encourage us to peace, but encourages us to divisiveness, in a world that does not encourage us to integrity, but encourages us to, share on Facebook all the best moments and like censor out all of our weaknesses, in a world that does not encourage us to community, but encourages us to like toxic individualism, in a world that does not encourage us to equality, but encourages us to make divisions among people. So what does it mean to do that? And that's fundamentally an exile experience, So that has been alive for me for years. But then you look around today and there are so many Americans who are feeling like, is this really my country? When President Trump was elected, there were people who felt like, oh, this isn't really my country. But when Obergefell was handed down, there were also people who felt like, oh, this isn't really my country. Like, what does it mean to have all of this change that makes what felt familiar feel unfamiliar? So I think a lot of people are struggling with feeling like exiles. It's not a new feeling. It's we're reading in Israel was literally chopped up and the people were dispersed throughout, Babylon, and, they had their exile. As a Black American, there's always been a sense of like, this is my country, but, is it really? This is my place, but there are hostile forces out there, that can kind of get you at any time. So this feeling of alienation, just it is so alive for so many of us. And so this passage just really spoke to me as the right thing to bring here now, because we're going into this election. Who knows what the future will bring, but whatever it brings, God has plans for us to give us a hope and a future. And as we'll discuss, there's guidance and direction for us as we navigate what it means to live as a people of faith, in a world where that is often a challenge.
Well, I think it's time to hear the words. Sarah Cushman has generously agreed to read this to us. So Sarah, I think Jen's going to put the passage up for us to see, and we're going to hear the words from Sarah, and then we'll give you all a chance to share for a little while with each other. Thank you, Adria.
This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile.
And so at this point, we have our queries, and you'll go into breakout rooms. And I want to invite you to consider where we are now and what God is calling us to do in the future. What is God calling us to do now and next? These are the queries that spoke to my heart to bring to you, that I felt God calling me to offer you. But as always, if the Spirit has planted something else in you, please, please, please share that instead. As we open up for sharing of what rose for you from this passage, one thing that rose for me that I'd like to share is that 70-year period feels to me so important, because what it means is that God was calling Israel to plant its gardens and commit to the good of the cities where people found themselves, and commit to their neighbors, their Babylonian neighbors, and marry off their children, even though anybody who was old enough to hear the prophecy and know what it meant was not going to see the return from captivity, was not going to see the return from exile. And so that reality of planting seeds for fruit that we will never see, and living today for a future that we may not witness, but that we know in our hearts will come, just felt very powerful for me. And I wanted to share that.
Don Campbell.
Yeah, I was very moved by that piece, and as Adria just said about the 70 years. So people are there, they're loving the place where they have found themselves. And it's sort of akin to, you know, the thought that I'd had was it sort of akin to the loving your enemies thing, only even deeper than that. And what I don't quite know how it's going to work, that in 2 or 3 generations, people are going to want to go home to some place they've never been. Wow, what is that? How do we get to that? That's the, maybe we're the ones that are going to do that, and maybe we're not. And there's a lot of that in the Bible. I mean, Moses didn't get to go to the promised land, right? So, and the whole generation of people that went with him couldn't go, you know, left Egypt. So it's a lot of this, looking at that generational turnover. What are we building for?
David?
Me? Okay. There's 2 things I want to say, but I'll only do one now, and I'll come back to the other if we still have time. I was really thrilled that you chose this, Adria. It was, when I was in seminary, I took a course called Introduction to the Hebraic Way of Thinking. We didn't learn to read or speak Hebrew, but we studied key words. And one of the favorite ones was shalom. And if you read this passage, verse 7, Hebrew, it's shalom. And it's translated a number of different ways. I won't take your time, I'm just going by memory, but 4 different English translations have 4 different renditions, you know, prosperity, the good, the well-being. But what that does, it implies that peace, or seek the peace of the city I send you to, it conveys that peace is, as Dr. King says, is more than the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice, well-being. So what we are to work for in the society where we may feel otherwise alienated is the well-being of everyone. And it means justice, equity, respect. It's not just, okay, grin and bear it. I guess we'll not make too much trouble and we'll live through it. It's a call to active engagement, and I'm very excited by it.
Jeff Bellows?
It seems to me that the only true exile is when you're separated from God. And if you keep yourself with God, as it says in Romans, all things work for good for he who loves God. And it won't necessarily be what you want, but it will be good.
That friend speaks my mind.
There's one friend in the chat who wants me to ask about verse 8, where it says, "Don't let the prophets and diviners deceive you."
One thing that actually, Peter and I and our elder Peter had our own breakout room, and that verse actually came out, and it struck me because I didn't know quite, like, how does that fit into this and fit into where we are right now. And Peter read, Peter Blood Patterson read from the Message, And and what they talk about in the message paraphrase is the talking heads and the know-it-alls, and it feels like an indictment of our current world, where you can find a pundit to say anything. You know, if you want to hear a certain message, you just turn on Fox. You don't like that message, turn on MSNBC. You want a message that feels a little more middle of the road, just turn on CNN. There is a prophet for any message that you want to hear. And so the question becomes, you know, how do we know? How do we stand apart from the people who would tell us the fantasies and things that we would like to hear, and lean on the truth that comes only from God?
Susanna Rose.
Last month, I'll let you get to you in a second, Susanna. Carl was led to bring us to the issue of grief in a Psalm 22. And it rose in him because of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the sense of fear of losing so much from her death. And I've been looking at a series of quotes from the writer Walter Brueggemann, who wrote a great deal about prophecy. And perhaps, Jen, you can put in the chat the one that's for Pioneer, breakoutpioneer.org.uk. This is a series of quotes from him. And there's one that I was looking at here that says, the proper idiom of the prophet in cutting through royal numbness is language of grief. And I think what Brueggemann is saying is the false prophets are constantly telling you everything's okay. The pandemic is over. America is great. We're not a racist country. All these lies, you know, about what's going on. And it's painful to look at the truth. But God tells us the truth through our prophets, even when it's very painful news, even when it's a bitter pill. And that's something that the king doesn't want to hear. The king doesn't want to hear the bad news that racism, unfortunately, is still alive and well in our country and the world. He doesn't want to hear the bad news that the pandemic is not over. You know, that guy, 45, kept saying, oh, that Democratic convention was all bad news. Don't listen to those bad news prophets. Well, you know what? The fact is, there's a lot that is very, very different than the way it could and should be. Sorry. I didn't realize you were about to speak, Susanna. Go for it.
Mm-hmm. I think this kind of follows from what you were saying, Peter. I was struck by the revelation that in our group, people spoke of being in exile from something that we had actually never known. One of us spoke about a sense of being in exile from the kingdom of heaven itself, from a place of justice and peace, as if we had actually experienced that. And that was what we expected, you know, it ought to be like that. Some of us feel a sense of exile from the America that we were taught about that never existed. You know, that was never there. And yet we want there to be this Thanksgiving where we're sharing everything with the Native Americans. And we want it to be a place of freedom for everybody and respect, but it's not. And yet there is a sense of exile from the dream that we thought this was America, maybe at some point in our lives. One of us didn't actually came to America growing up elsewhere and never actually had that sense of, well, this one place is wholly my home. And another of us longed for a Quaker community that had never been really experienced, but wanted that. So what do? You know, there's a sense of needing to connect with our hearts, with others, to make, someone spoke about, well, what choices are we making? We make choices based on this longing that we have within us, and trust that God will help lead us there, but be part of making it possible.
Ann Collins.
I was reflecting on the second query and what a call to being active we were given, to plant gardens and to marry and to wish for the welfare of everyone. And as we prepare for God to gather us. And so we were struck by God holding us in that time, in a time of grief and exile, which we're going through. I mean, I personally, well, I have had loved ones to die, but not neighbors to die, an older neighbor. So I've actually known people who died from COVID, but so many people have lost so much. And I haven't in this time. And yet we still have, we're going to be held and by God, and he's going to gather us from this exile, and that we can live in a time of grief with also a time of faith, that we will be whole again.
Beth.
It's actually Jeremiah.
Oh wait, there's a Beth B.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Hi. Well, it's very interesting, but not surprising that I was feeling led to this passage recently. And the place where it took me was as I was looking for our community as we, of friends here in Portland, as we head into a season when we're not going to be able to gather outside. And there's a way in which we continue to say, well, you know, I like Zoom worship, but it's not like this, or, you know, the sort of preoccupation of our exile, of looking back to our imagined past and feeling that this was the this is the invitation to find the richness in this new place, to listen to what is God growing here in this time. And yeah, I shared with my group that image that came to me was that we're cloth that's been cut from the loom. The structure of our meetings that we use to weave us together is gone. We can't go to the meeting house to gather our hold our committee meetings like we used to. And, you know, but the cloth is meant to be cut from the loom. And what do we see now? What do we now understand? What is our purpose in this time?
Jeremiah.
Yeah, I really appreciated thinking about the second query and the part about, you know, living in exile and settling down and having houses and gardens. It just speaks to me that it's important for us to know that we're in community, whether we want to or not. We are in community with everyone. And as much as some of us would like to think, oh, we're separate and we have the right idea, and if we could just convince those folks, we are all in this together. And if we can't find a way to live our lives in witness to what we believe and to truly love those who see it differently, you know, then we're, I think, missing the point.
Sita.
Hi, this is Sita. This planting gardens and building houses resonates for me with the parable of the 10 talents and our second query. You know, this is a time in which we're cocooned, and how we respond to this cocoon will set a path for our emergence from this time. It also resonates with John Woolman's injunction to heed the stern lessons of God. This is a stern lesson because we need it as humanity. And so this is a time for us to really plant our gardens and really care for our families, those we think of as our family and those who become our family through happenstance in this time.
Chuck.
Well, what's rising up for me came up in the triad. Actually, we had some similar feelings. Was feeling like an exile in my own meeting. Being a Christian in a meeting that's becoming ever more secular, feeling like there's tolerance of Christianity, but not nurturance. And I realize that God's present, but I feel like my community is shifting away from me, or I'm shifting away from it. But it feels exiling. I feel exiled, and that's painful.
Lewis, Ron, Amos.
It's Rua who's going to speak. As we tend our gardens, I haven't really heard yet, which I think is critical what we need to be doing in exile to be able to return, is to see ourselves as part of the whole community of life, and that the family includes all of the non-human as well, and that we're equals in that, whether we swat the mosquito or not, or whether we eat the chicken or not, we are equals in this world. And if we don't embrace that, I don't think we'll ever go home.
I really appreciate that. And that was something that struck me in the passage, and I didn't have words, and I appreciate that Rua did, because connecting to the non-human parts of creation, I think gives us, or should give us, a better sense of our own place and our own smallness with respect to God's greatness. And humility is a lesson that is painful to get, but you can never have too much of humility and compassion.
Sabrina. You're muted.
Now, can you hear me? Thank you. This passage is really striking, and the way that Adria introduced it really hit to all my election anxiety. It seems to be challenging me to consider that regardless of who wins, whether one's preferred candidate wins or loses, we still live among strangers. We're still living in a land of strangers. And who's to say whose land it is? So I just like to try to bring that into the next week, you know, that we are encouraged to pray for the welfare of the country and everyone, whether it's ours or not.
Jan Hoffman.
Am I unmuted now? I don't see my face, so I was in my small group struck by our sort of, I guess, our condition in relationship to God. I found it very difficult to even answer, how are we called to live in this time as we prepare for God to gather us from exile and captivity? Are we being prepared? Do we believe in God? I don't know what sense of God I have. I used to have a very strong sense of guidance, and it is very difficult to connect with that energy that flows through all of life. There's so many places where it just seems to have a dead end. There's no life energy there. And after a while, you just feel separated. And I don't know where my faith is that God, in fact, is going to bring us back from captivity, because captivity is what resonates with me more, that you get captured by other things that are not God. And it's hard to maintain a sense. So I'm kind of praying for some kind of faith. Will God does God have a plan? And will I accept it no matter what it is? No matter what it is. Will I see the life in whatever? And it used to be easier. But thanks for the question.
And Peter is telling me we have time for one more. So Chris, will you close us out?
Okay, I guess I'm unmuted.
You're unmuted now.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder whether our perspective of the world is a little bit warped. It's almost like we believe that God looked down upon the world and saw all of the problems and said, well, I'm going to form this group called the Quakers, and they'll be able to solve all these problems. And so now the assignment for Quakers is to solve all the world's problems. And honestly, sometimes it's a little arrogant to think that we have the answers to all of these problems. And oftentimes, it seems to me that throughout the scriptures, arrogance and pride and making God into our own image seem to be the big problems of the Israelites and whatever other group. And this is a common human problem. I used to think that what's wrong with those Israelites? You know, God took them through the Red Sea, and then, you know, a few months later, they're whining and wanting to go back and saying, where's the food? And I'm starving. We forget so quickly, and we forget our own history. Our own history can be arrogant too in some ways, but we forget that maybe that wasn't God's reason for forming us at all. It seems like when George Fox didn't know what to do and had lost hope in everything and everyone around him, that's when he heard the voice, which said, there's one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to thy condition. And he recognized that Jesus was available to him in an inward way, in a way that he hadn't heard about or known about before. And he wanted to know and experience that power and transformation in his life, and gathered others around him who also wanted that experience. Maybe the reason why we're all in exile is to remember, to try to remember that there's a power greater than ourselves that can teach us when we're willing to listen. And sometimes it might take 70 years to learn that lesson.
Thank you. So let's take a moment to breathe in.
Peter?
Yes.
Before you close this out, and I feel like I'm just, but God has just put it on my heart to say, and I am so grateful for all of the ministry and the way that this group has ministered to me, and particularly this, that Israel was not tasked to send out cartographers to find a way back home, that Israel was not tasked with creating academies of political science or schools of warfare to overthrow Babylon, to find its own freedom, to solve its own problem, but to seek God with its whole heart.
So we're going to formally close now, but there'll be actually, you can stick around longer if you'd like a little bit more informal chance to share and talk with each other. We'll continue probably till about quarter of in the East 6, but I want to thank a few people. Of course, especially thank you to you, Adria, for your grace and your faithfulness today. I want to thank Jen and Margaret for Beacon Hill and Woolman Hill for taking up this nudge that I felt to do this and going with it so extravagantly and wonderfully. This is a really hard time for Quaker centers, for retreat centers. And please do all you can to support these places because we need them to nurture our life together. So I urge you to go to their sites and donate. I want to thank my elder today, Peter Letson. He's on my care of ministry committee at Mount Toby Friends Meeting for care of my teaching ministry. And he was, with very little notice, agreed to come today. And to our reader today, Sarah Cushman. And of course, to all of you. So Colin Saxton was here among us today. He may have left by now, but he will be here more in the forefront a month from today, the first Sunday afternoon in December. Colin hails from Newberg, Oregon, and was the Bible half hours at New England Yearly Meeting not long ago. And so I hope you will be able to join us for Colin, who is our next guest leader. And I have some exciting news. I think it's fair to say that Woolman Hill and Beacon Hill has, what do you call it when a TV series is continued? I can't think of the term, but we've been resubscribed for another set of 3 sessions starting in January. There's some exciting people that will be the guest leaders, and those will be available publicly before Colin's session next month. So we hope you'll stay with this journey starting in January for another 3 sessions, and who knows, maybe throughout the spring as we have this strange time of being with each other online. So I'd like to open this up without any further ado. Why don't we continue to raise hands? It seems to be working well. And Jen or I will recognize you, and you can ask a question. You can share something that's on your heart if you didn't have a chance to do so already. If you need to go now, you're released, as they say, among friends. And I want to apologize to you, Adria. I always try to say at the end, you get the last word, and I kind of forgot that. So I'm glad you stopped me.
I snatched it away. But God told me to, so I don't feel bad.
Do you have anything else on your heart right now before we open it up?
No, just gratitude and looking forward to what else arises. I feel like I am just so blessed to be with this group. So that's all. The Bible tells us to pray for our leaders, and I will say in candor that I have not done that. I almost never do that. There's something that feels weird about it to me, because God is, is the God of every country. So why, and every city and every town. So why should I pray for mine in particular? And yet, there are many children in the world. So why should I care for mine in particular? My son is 4. Why should I give him dinner and not give somebody else's child dinner? Well, the answer is because he's mine. And because to have a natural affection for what God has placed in your influence and control and in your physical proximity is good. To limit your natural effect, to limit your affection to those things is bad, but to have affection is good. And that affection should be cultivated and is a good thing and not a bad thing. So I will say that today was not the first time that I prayed for President Trump, but it is the first time that I prayed for President Trump and Mitch McConnell and the current administration and everyone who will vote and everyone in my state and city and all of our leaders, including those that I have doubts about whether or not they're serving us as they should. I don't know what the point of that story is. Maybe it's about praying for Babylon, but I don't think that the timing is accidental. I don't know what will happen Tuesday, and even to think of it as Tuesday, in the weeks and months ahead. I don't know what the election will say, but I do know that regardless of who wins, that we will still be called to pray for our leaders and to seek the good of the city in which we find ourselves in exile. And we will still be in exile regardless of who wins. And so I would encourage us all to be vigilant and to be careful and to be courageous and to be full of a love that can only come from God. This world is not our home, as the wonderful old tune goes. And yet, while we're here, let us love, and let us love those with whom we find ourselves, all of those with whom we find ourselves.